From what I've heard, in many places, people deal with haunted houses like this. They drop the price way down to tempt others, especially young people, to rent. If someone lives there for more than 3 months without any weird stuff happening, the house is considered to be cleansed and the price will go back up, just like any normal property. Sounds a bit crazy, huh? But with high rent prices, plenty of people are willing to take the risk. So today's story is about a poster on Douban who shared his experiences of renting 4 haunted houses. If that piques your interest, stick around and don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm here for you every Saturday night, so don't miss out. Hong Kong real estate is very expensive, yes, but that's the normal price. What about the abnormal price? Well, if you're lucky, you could rent a 30 square meter apartment for just a few $100s. If you're really lucky, it could be even cheaper. How? You just need to be brave and not believe in ghosts. 8 years ago, I came to Hong Kong for school, scraping together whatever money I could for tuition. I could have applied for a dorm room, but it was too late and I couldn't afford the high fees, so I had to rent a place on my own. But once I started looking, I shockingly realized that off-campus housing was almost twice the cost of the dorms. Desperate, I took my savings and started searching everywhere, wandering through streets and alleys until I stumbled upon High Street. If you Google High Street, you'll find out it's notorious, a street famous for its low rent and haunted houses. The people who live there, they're usually social outcasts, drug addicts, cross-dressers, and broke students like me. So unless you're really desperate, no one will live there. It didn't take long for me to find a landlord. She was an odd old woman, talking in an eerie way. The apartment was a tiny studio, barely 8 square meters, but it had a private bathroom and shower, and the rent was only 900 HKD a month. Given the creepy reputation of the area, I tried to haggle, asking for 700 a month. I expected her to refuse, but to my surprise, she agreed right away. That's when I feel like I might have been tricked. I signed the lease for 6 months and moved in that very day. But that night, I had the worst nightmares. Nightmares where I was dragged through different eras, tortured, burned alive, and chased for money. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of my nightmare. I lived on the 4th floor with no elevator, so I had to take the stairs every day. The stairwell stank horribly and was dark and grimy. The walls were covered in red graffiti, and each floor had offerings to the earth god, adding to the eerie atmosphere. Across the hall from me lived a lonely old man. He would sit in his doorway every day, staring blankly at the wall opposite. Several times, I caught him staring back at me when I came home, giving me the chills. The old man's behavior never changed, so I got used to it. Until one day, he suddenly stood up, holding a broom in one hand and a candle in another hand, staring intently at my door. Jesus, was he trying to scare me to death? I mustered up the courage to ask, "Sir, are you cleaning?" But he looked at me angrily, his mustache quivering, and asked, "Do your parents know you live here?" Sir, your Mandarin is really good. You're not from Hong Kong." He didn't answer, just gave me a fierce look before glancing down the hallway and saying, "You're a university student, right? From the mainland? You shouldn't live here. Come into my apartment. I need your help with something." I stood there with my backpack, unsure of what to do. While I was hesitating, he spoke again. "Come in quickly. It's for your own good." So I entered his apartment. As soon as I stepped inside, I was startled. Right in front of me was a massive statue of Guan Yu, over 2 meters tall, staring fiercely at the door. The old man offered me a seat and poured me a cup of tea. Then he started telling me the story of the apartment I had rented. It turns out that the apartment once belonged to an elderly couple and their 3-year-old granddaughter. They were a harmonious family. One night, a woman came on knocking on doors, crying. She knocked on the old man's door first, but as soon as he opened it, she saw the Guangong statue and bolted. She then knocked on the elderly couple's door, whispering and crying. From that night on, the couple argued constantly, and the little girl cried every night. Then, one day, everything went eerily quiet. For a whole week, no one saw or heard from the couple. The old man grew suspicious and called the police, who forced the door open and found them all dead. The wife had been stabbed multiple times, the husband had a single cut to the neck, and the little girl had been given a lethal dose of sedatives and starved to death. Since then, the apartment had been empty. and the old man would hear strange noises from inside, like the family was still living there until I moved in. Since I moved in, the old man started watching my house. Until one evening, that same old woman reappeared, heading towards my apartment directly. He instantly shouted at her, and she hurriedly left. Just 1 minute after, I was back at home. By this point, I was completely terrified. The old man told me to move out and stay with him instead. He mentioned that both of his sons were living abroad and he was lonely, so he'd like me to keep him company. Later, he called the landlord to cancel my lease and she didn't argue, knowing she was at fault. Seeing how sincere he was, I agreed. Life settled down for a few months, but just as I was beginning to forget about the whole thing, the old man suddenly told me to move back to the school dorms, saying the couple and their granddaughter had come to find him. He gave me a meaningful look and I instantly understood. A deep sadness filled me. So I reapplied for a dorm. On the day I moved out, the old man sat by the Guan Yu statue, watching me. I packed my things and said goodbye, but he just smiled silently. That night, the old man passed away. The police then investigated his death, and I told them about the old woman incident, but without any evidence, the case was dropped. So the first haunted house incident ended abruptly like that. Then I lived in the dorm for a year before going to France for an exchange program. When I returned, I had to rent another place off campus, and wouldn't you know it, I ended up in another haunted apartment. But what can you do? It was cheap. After spending 6 months on exchange in Lyon, I came back to Hong Kong, but I didn't get a scholarship, so I was in financial trouble again. On top of that, my parents had a bad investment and had just had another baby, so they wouldn't help me out. With no other options, I posted on CSSA, looking for 2 roommates, a guy and a girl, to share a place with. We planned to find a 3-bedroom apartment with a budget of no more than 7,000 HKD. But when we told the agent this, he just shook his head. Just when we were about to give up, one day, out of the blue, the agent called and said there was a landlord who was okay with the price. The house was in Kennedy Town's Kong Long Lao, 7,500 HKD a month, all utilities included. As soon as I heard this, I knew it was probably a haunted apartment, but my 2 roommates, clueless as they were, immediately agreed to check it out the next day. If we translate Kong Long Lao directly into English, it means a building used to admire the dragon. It sounds beautiful, but now Kong Long Lao had acquired a bad reputation, with rumors of frequent supernatural events and murders. Gradually, people started moving out, making it a gathering place for illegal immigrants. The next day, we went to see the apartment as planned. The moment we entered the complex, it felt oppressive. The air didn't move at all. Soon, we met the landlord and she led us to the apartment. It was on the 9th floor of Block B. Surprisingly, the building had an elevator, and the apartment was over 65 square meters, with 3 bedrooms, a living room, and a balcony. My heart sank. I was sure it was a haunted place. Otherwise, it didn't make sense that the rent was so low, unless the landlord was out of her mind. The landlord was very straightforward. She didn't beat around the bush and told us right away that it was a haunted apartment. The incident had happened only 6 months ago, which is why the rent was so cheap. When she heard that we were students from the mainland, she assumed we didn't believe in ghosts, so she was willing to rent it to us. After hearing this, the girl with us hesitated, but the 2 of us guys didn't mind. We discussed it, and the girl decided to call her family to ask for advice. She also asked our names and ID numbers, probably to check our 八字 or something. After a lot of consideration, she agreed. Once we signed the lease, I asked the landlord what had happened in the apartment. She told us that a primary school teacher used to live there. He was a kind and hardworking man, often tutoring students for free. But one night, when the mother came to pick up her child, she caught him molesting 2 young boys. When the teacher realized he'd been caught, he killed the mother and the 2 boys, then jumped from the 9th floor. Honestly, haunted apartments are pretty similar: violent death and unresolved grievances. As a medical student, I've seen all kinds of deaths in anatomy class, so I wasn't too bothered. Besides, the rent was cheap, so we decided to stay. At first, nothing unusual happened. I was busy with my studies, often leaving early and coming home late, so I didn't see my roommates much. But one night, when I came home, I found them sitting at the table, waiting for me. I was a bit surprised and asked what was going on. The girl asked if I'd been sleeping well lately and if I had any nightmares. I said yes, sometimes I dreamed about kids playing. As soon as I said it, I realized that the children had died in this apartment, and the more horrible thing was, both of us had the same dream. The guy who was studying science suggested that we should move out and just forfeit the 2-month deposit. I said it seemed a bit irresponsible to leave after only a few days, especially since we wouldn't find another place this cheap. Plus, we would save the money and use it to take a trip to Malaysia, which we've been wanting to do for a while. They agreed that made sense, so we decided to stay for another month and see how it went. And that's when things took a turn. One night, I was covering a shift for my senior. In the middle of the night, my phone rang. It was my male roommate asking if I was home. I was confused since I had told them I'd been on duty and wouldn't be back. Then I heard our female roommate screaming in the background. My roommate quickly said that they could hear children playing in my room, and it was really loud. They were scared out of their minds, didn't know what to tell the police, and didn't speak Cantonese, so they begged me to come home. In a panic, I told another senior and rushed back in taxi. When I got home, the girl was still crying, and the guy had barricaded my door with a table, looking completely lost. I was both amused and exasperated. I said, "If there's really a ghost in there, do you think a table is going to stop it?" I moved the table aside, and just as I opened the door, I saw 2 small shadows darted across the balcony. I jumped back in shock and asked if they had seen the shadows, but they said they hadn't. I cautiously opened the door and found the bedroom in disarray with books scattered all over the floor. As I was deciding what to do next, I heard the sound of something breaking on the balcony. I grabbed the mug and slowly walked toward the balcony while they watched from the doorway. I yanked the curtains open, but there was nothing there. Only the ceramic pot had been shattered. I looked out through the glass door, nothing unusual. It was already past 3 a.m. I decided then and there that we weren't staying in that apartment anymore. We just had to forfeit the money. The next day, we called the landlord, and she didn't argue. She came over right away to handle the paperwork. After we told her what had happened, the landlord suddenly broke down and started crying, which scared the hell out of us. There was a middle-aged woman who had come with her. She seemed to understand what was going on and pulled us aside, said, "We won't charge you for breaking the lease. What happened last night might be your imagination, so please don't talk about it to others." The landlord, she's actually the mother of one of the children who died. She bought this house due to missing her son. We were all shocked and felt a mix of emotions. It's likely they say online, what you fear as a ghost is someone else's loved one, someone they can never see again. After moving back to the dorms, my 2 friends stayed at Lee Hei San Hall, while I lived in Ho Sen Han Hall. Although it was a bit more expensive, life was calm and peaceful. I stayed there until I graduated. When my application to study in the US fell through, I ended up staying in Hong Kong to pursue a PhD. Unfortunately, my apply for dormitory hadn't been approved, so I had to find a new place to live. After my previous experiences, I decided to stay away from haunted houses. But with a limited budget, I had trouble finding a decent apartment. Eventually, I stepped into a haunted house again, and that's the 3rd one, which left me a deep psychological scar. This place had a good location, right next to King's College. The room itself was nice, with a window and plenty of space. I lived in the secondary bedroom, with the landlord in the master bedroom. The landlord was a woman in her 30s, very polite and well-mannered. The listed rent was originally $5,000, but she offered it to me for just $3,000. I immediately knew what that meant, and casually said, $2,500, I'll sign the lease right now. She agreed without hesitation and mentioned how she always tried to be kind to students. Then she gave me a smile that sent shivers down my spine. On my first night there, I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning in bed. Finally, I got up to the bathroom, but as soon as I opened the door, I was stunned. The landlord was crouching on the balcony, wearing nothing but a tank top and underwear, scrubbing the glass door with a squeaking noise. I stood there awkwardly, then quickly retreated to my room. It was 1:30 a.m., and I didn't get a wink of sleep after that. The next morning, we ran into each other in the living room. I asked her how she slept, and she said she went to bed early and slept well. Clearly, she was lying. But why? After class, I went to a nearby Japanese store and bought a butcher knife for self-defense, then went back to my room and sat against the wall. At midnight, I peeked out again, and sure enough, there she was, scrubbing the glass. I decided it was better to ask directly, so I coughed loudly to get her attention, but she ignored me completely. I raised my voice and asked why she was up so late. She angrily turned around and snapped, "I'm cleaning the class. I don't want to sleep." From her tone, it didn't seem like she was sleepwalking. I chatted with her a bit more and nothing seemed out of the ordinary, so I went back to bed, though the nightmares continued. For a whole week, I had nightmares every night, waking up with headaches and feeling exhausted. My friends urged me to apply for dormitory housing, so I did and waiting for approval. One afternoon, I came home early to do some cleaning. The landlord was also tidying up, carrying a stack of neatly folded sheets. She greeted me politely and said she had a dryer in her room and leave me to use it. But when I stepped into her room, every hair on my body stood on end. There was a shrine for her late husband. She walked over to it, bowed, and said, "This is the new student who just moved in. He's studying at HKU. Please bless him with success in his studies and good fortune for his family." Then she told me to go back to my room, saying she'd bring the clothes over once done. I stiffly made my way back to my room, my mind unable to settle down for a long time. What was wrong with her? Who would keep a shrine to a dead person in their own room? Isn't she scared? With these thoughts swirling in my mind, I eventually drifted off to sleep. But it felt like I slept for centuries. I had a vivid dream where I saw a middle-aged man crashing through the window and falling to his death on Boham Road below. This scene just repeatedly played in my dream over and over again, until I jolted awake and saw that it was already 6 p.m. We lived together like this for about a month. She started regularly washing and drying my clothes, folding them neatly in her room for me to pick up. Other than that, nothing strange happened, except for the fact that I had a dream every night, and even medication didn't help. One weekend, I went into her room to get my clothes, and that's when I noticed there was a locked storage cabinet in there. Just then, the landlord came back, so I didn't think much of it at the time. But that night, I had a dream where the man who always jumped out of the window actually emerged from that storage cabinet. Then I can't help suspecting there was something wrong with that cabinet. The next morning, I got up and went straight to that glass door in my dream, inspecting it closely. "Stay back! The window's loose!" I turned around to see the landlord glaring at me, but her expression quickly softened. The change was so abrupt, it startled me again. Afterward, I went to the lab and told my colleagues about what had happened. They urged me to move out and joked about how sometimes dreams can predict real events, scaring me so much that I didn't want to go back home. But I got caught up in my experiments and forgot about it. That night, I had a tranquil time. The landlord wasn't scrubbing the glass. But around 3 a.m., a strange noise came from the living room. I peeked out and saw the landlord cleaning the glass again, this time with a long mop, scrubbing so hard it seemed like she wanted to break through the glass. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to get to the bottom of this, so I called out, "Let me help you with that." "F off, you wanna die?" she screamed, her voice filled with fury. Her outburst sent me a shiver. Then she completely lost it, grabbing anything within reach and throwing it around, all while cursing, "Stupid man, dirty scum, all of you should die. Just jump off." I realized I had no control over the situation, so I called 999. By the time the police arrived, the landlord was a complete wreck with disheveled hair and wild eyes, still ranting. The neighbors had gathered at the door, trying to calm her down. In the end, the police took both of us to the station. I explained the whole situation and requested to terminate the lease. When the landlord heard this, she screamed, "No, she has to die. She must die here. All men must die." Her outburst even startled the police officers. I told them about my recurring dreams and asked them to check the storage cabinet in her room. One of the officers, who lived nearby, told me that her husband had committed suicide by jumping through the glass window and falling to his death on Boham Road. Hearing this, I strengthened my resolve to move out. The police escorted both of us back to the apartment to collect my belongings. Once there, I insisted that the officers check the storage cabinet. The landlord sneered and said, "Go ahead, but don't say I didn't warn you." The officers were hesitant, saying they didn't have the authority to search it. Hearing this, the landlord gave a chilling smile and, with a sudden swift kick, broke open the cabinet door. What we saw inside shocked everyone. There was a small doll tied up and stuffed inside a shattered glass cup. A long nail had been driven through its head, with a man's photo nailed to its face. We all gasped in horror, but just as we were taking it all in, another photo fell out of the cabinet. It was a picture of the landlord. Seeing this, she flew into a rage, pointing at me and screaming, "Did you do this? It had to be you. You're the devil. You cursed me." She then tried to lunge at me, but the police officers held her back. Then she turned to her husband's shrine and screamed, "You did this. You knew all along, didn't you? You bastard. You and the woman will never have peace." With that, she grabbed a chair and smashed the shrine to pieces. The officers had to call for backup. In the end, the police helped me pack my things and escorted me to the lab. That marked the end of this terrifying ordeal. This experience left me with a deep psychological scar, not from ghosts, but from the fear of being cursed by a witch. I even saw a psychologist a few times afterward. The setters eventually helped me apply for student housing, and a week later, I moved into graduate house. Because of the witch incident, I was fortunate enough to move into the graduate house, but it seemed that fate wasn't done with me yet, as a fourth haunted house, or you can call it that, quietly appeared in my life. Graduate house rooms are shared by 2 people, and someone was already living in my room when I moved in. However, due to the demanding schedule of a graduate student, my roommate was always out early and back late, so I never actually met him. Strangely, though, his toiletries in the bathroom looked like they hadn't been used in a long time. Sometimes I even wondered if I really had a roommate. I lived there for a few months in peace until one day I got a call from an unknown number that cleared up my doubts. It was my roommate calling. He welcomed me and explained that he was on a business trip and wouldn't be back for another 1 or 2 months. He mentioned that sometimes he'd have packages delivered and asked me to keep an eye out for them. He also had a plant in his room and asked if I could water it once a week. I agreed. We chatted for a bit and then he hung up. The first time I went into his room was on a Saturday morning. I saw the plant, a lush green orchid, sitting on the desk. Next to it was a note that said, "There are a few bottles of yogurt in the fridge. If you come to water the plant in the morning, enjoy a bottle for breakfast. If you water it in the evening, have one as a late night snack. But if you water it at noon, you'll have to clean the floor, because plants shouldn't be watered at midday." I thought my roommate was pretty considerate, so I opened the fridge and drank 2 bottles right away. Then I watered the plant, swept the floor, and left. The second time I went in, I took a closer look around his room. His bookshelf was neatly lined with medical textbooks and notebooks. I randomly pulled out one notebook which had Department of Medicine, Stephen Lau written on it. The notes inside were about research ethics. A few weeks passed and I started thinking that my roommate should be back soon. Surely he'd want to treat me to a meal. But as the days went by, there was still no sign of him. During this time, though, I was sleeping unusually well. It felt as if someone was taking care of me at midnight, because every time I woke up, the blanket was neatly covering me, even tucked in at the corners, and whenever I worked on papers or research in my room, inspiration flowed effortlessly. A few more weeks passed, I finished all the yogurt, and the orchid was thriving, but my roommate still hadn't returned. Then one morning, I was woken up by a sound of someone moving. I thought my roommate had finally come back, so I went out to see. I saw a young man with several large suitcases moving into another room. I greeted him. "Are you Steven? Where have you been for so long?" He looked at me, puzzled, and said he wasn't Steven. He was a new student. I'm just as confused and told him that someone was already living in that room, and the guy was just on a business trip. He looked at his key and said, "That's impossible. This is an empty room, and I have the right key." I insisted he was mistaken and pointed out that the room still had someone's belongings in it. He was also surprised and decided to check with the building manager. A few minutes later, the tutor and some graduate house staff arrived. They apologized to the new student and began moving out the staff from the room. This left me even more bewildered and anxious, so I asked what was going on. The tutor explained that the belongings were from a previous student. He patted me on the shoulders and said he'd explain everything to me later. At that moment, my heart sank. The tutor's mysterious tone made me sure that this wasn't going to be good news. I helped move the things, but asked to keep the orchid in my room, and they could take the rest of the books somewhere else. Afterward, the tutor explained that the previous occupant of the room was a PhD student in medicine. He had stomach cancer, late stage, and after some unsuccessful treatments, he went home, leaving these belongings behind. His roommate had kept them for him, but after moving out, the staff had been too busy to clear the room. I asked how the student was doing now, and the tutor said his condition was very serious and he probably wouldn't be coming back. So the new roommate moved in. Thinking back on the note and the yogurt, I felt a bit touched. Later, I went to the medical department to inquire about Steven. They told me he had already left, and his family was very upset, so I didn't need to visit them. But that wasn't the end of the story. One night, I came back around 10 p.m. After showering, I went to bed. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I was startled by a knock at the door. I got up to answer it, and my roommate was standing there with a broom. He said, "I heard someone showering and go into your room just now, but I know you took a shower at 11, so I wanted to check when you actually showered." I was a bit annoyed and told him I had showered at 11 and he must have heard the noise from the next room. He insisted it wasn't a mistake. This had been happening for days, always around 2 a.m., which didn't match my routine at all. I lost my patience and said, "Are you scared after hearing Steven's story? Even if Steven were here, he'd be staying in your room, not mine." Hearing this, my roommate got even more scared and asked if we could sleep with the door open. I agreed. The next night, I was working in the lab when my roommate called, asking if I wanted to grab dinner. He showed up at the lab shortly after, and I started feeling uneasy as soon as they started talking. He said he had confirmed with the tutor that Steven had actually been staying in my room. Before taking his leave, Steven had moved his belongings to the room across from mine. And since Steven's roommate was finishing his PhD, he moved out early, and the stuff hadn't been touched since. So the shadow that showered every night at 2 p.m. and then went into my room, it was definitely Steven. I stood there, stunned. My roommate said he wasn't going back that night, and I said I wouldn't either. We ended up taking a cab to Landlord. On the way, I told him about what had happened before he moved in. It had felt so warm and friendly back then with Steven, whom I had never met, offering me yogurt and even tucking me in at night. It seemed that Steven must have been a very gentle person in life. Being in the medical school, I knew how exhausting lab work could be. You'd fall asleep as soon as you hit the bed, yet Steven still took care of his plants, showing how much he appreciated the little things in life. But that note, was it written by Steven himself or someone else? My roommate suggested I compare the handwriting with Steven's notes, but I was too scared to do it. But deep down, I always knew the note was indeed written by Steven. Later, when the readmission day came, we were both forced to leave the dorm. As I was leaving, I thought long and hard, and in the end, I decided to plant a thriving orchid in the garden outside Graduate House. It now sits there with Long Fushan and Victoria Peak in the background, overlooking the entire HKU campus and even Victoria Harbor. Now Steven doesn't have to worry about his orchid anymore. Perhaps they are now together forever. And so, all the stories came to an end. Hong Kong is a wonderful place, full of beautiful scenes. These stories are dedicated to everyone who holds a fondness for Hong Kong, and to the memory of my dear roommate, Steven. That orchid, now thriving with lush leaves and graceful stems, stands as a gentle tribute, delicate and pure like morning dew, clear as waters and trees in view.